we'll go ahead and get started. Everyone, I'm Kerry Magruder, and I don't get to join you as often as I would like, but it's my joy to be here to interview Marty Folsom. So I asked all of you who are here to help me turn the tables on Marty, and he's in the hot spot this week, so it'll be a lot of fun. And
it's a warm spot.
Yes, so just a delight to have this opportunity, Marty. I'm going to put in the chat a file that is kind of an outline of some of the questions or topics that we might move through. It's a rather loose framework to guide our discussion. And so it's just been uploaded into the chat as a PDF if you want to download it. And it's also, if you want it later, but not now, you can go to the bibliography page on the Torrance website for Face-to-Face Volume 3. And I put a link to that record in the chat now as well. And that handout is downloadable from that page also. And once the video for this discussion is completed, it will be embedded in that page as well. All right, so Science as Faith and Faith as Science, Chapter 3 of Volume 3 of your Face-to-Face series, Marty. And
yes.
It's a delight that you selected that chapter for us to dive into today. But I'd like to start a little farther back, and that is at the dedication for the book, which I think was included in the PDF that people have. For the dedication is really a wonderful dedication. It's dedicated to James B. Torrance, who first opened the gates of heaven that I might glimpse the face of the triune God on this earth, and Alan Torrance, who embodies the delight of grace in expounding theology, fully living the pleasure of the gospel in this world. I have studied with the Father and the Son, lowercase f, lowercase s, and now live in their spirit, lowercase s again. So marvelous dedication, Marty.
Thank you.
Most of us here know you, but just as a refresher, could you remind us of your academic connections with the Torrance tradition?
Right. So I live in Seattle, and Seattle was one of the sites for Fuller Extension campuses. And so Todd Spidell was the one who was in charge of bringing people to those campuses. And so in the late 80s, he brought James Torrance for one of the master's degrees that I was working on to Seattle. So I took James Torrance for Systematic Theology 3. And that's where I really was introduced to the nature of Karl Barth's, the Torrance. Obviously, he was a Torrance, but the whole Torrance tradition was really brought to the table at that point. And it just gave me what I've been looking for, an understanding of a God who wasn't merely a set of arguments and a set of memorized statements, but that there was this dynamic, engaging God who comes to us and invites us to participate in our life. So when I was finished with that Fuller degree, I asked James, he had me as his TA when he would come back in later years. I also took him to the mountains for hikes and Snoqualmie Falls. So I had a wonderful time showing him the Northwest as well. But I asked him, so where should I go for doing a PhD? And he said, well, what do you want to do? And so I talked about the nature of being persons and relationship and all that. And he says, well, you need to go study with my son in New Zealand. So that is what took me to New Zealand to study with Alan Torrance. So I was there 3 years. He left to go finish his PhD, actually. So Douglas Campbell finished that doctorate with me down there. But everything that Alan Torrance taught, from his undergraduate to his graduate to his doctoral seminars, I sat in everything that he did. So I well and truly absorbed much of what he'd done. And he is very TF fluent. He lived with TF. So I never met TF, and I always considered myself really in the J.B. Allen tradition. For the last 5 years, I've really invested very heavily in reading and writing in the TF tradition. So that's been continuing the quest for what it means to be informed in a dynamic Trinitarian relational kind of theology.
Thank you. That's quite a quite a connection to the Torrance tradition, both broad and deep. What was the title of your dissertation there again?
It was a comparative assessment of the concept of freedom in the anthropologies of John McMurray, John Zazoulis, and Karl Barth.
Great, thank you.
So the question, what do we mean by being persons, and particularly free persons, which for all three of them, to be fully person is to be a free person. So that was the question.
Yes. Now, let's expand a little bit to your calling and your vocation. In the introduction on page 13, which many people might not have, you describe yourself as a theologian, as a former church staff worker, and a marriage and family therapist. And you say, quote, "My goal is to be more like a specialist in relationships," end quote. Mm-hmm. So how does your vocational arc that includes but transcends that academic trajectory, how does that illustrate putting your commitment to relational theology into practice?
Right. So I really started out my life in ministry with Young Life. So I worked with kids, and my first degree was a bachelor's degree in youth ministry. The nature of youth ministry tends to be very programmatic. And so there was something that was started to awake inside, why are we not doing the work of really building on what it means to have a relationship with the living God here? But it's hard to find people who really speak that kind of language. So my whole 20-year higher education quest, in a sense, was answering that question. What does it look like to really be a theologian? How do I understand the nature of God as one who does that? And there was a lot of resistance to relational theology in the 70s, particularly. So I was fighting against a stream. It's kind of like social Trinitarianism today. There are some people who you say, well, your social Trinitarianism is just natural theology. And there are others who you say, well, you're just doing good Trinitarian incarnational theology, but the term hasn't been well clarified. So for me to be in ministry with Young Life, and then I've worked in 5 churches doing primarily education, mostly adult education. In one church, I wrote a complete curriculum, kindergarten through to adult. I'm really attempting to reframe the nature of what education does in learning to relate to this God who has come to us and what it means to be transformed in that process. So my life in the church has really been around rethinking the nature of what that looks like, and then also to do education that really invites people to see themselves as gifted within the life of the body of Christ. So at one church, John Knox Presbyterian Church, I had the John Knox Equipping Center. And so it was a lay level theological engagement that assumed that everyone had a gift to give, and they just needed to be given some formation and foundation to be able to function in the life of the church doing that. And then in recent years, the Washington Seminary, I've been the chancellor of Washington Seminary. Each student I said, I have a master's degree program, but we have to ask the question, what is it that God's called you specifically to do? So to take Trinitarian theology and to see somebody involved in ministry or in the arts or in marketplace ministry or in counseling, and to ask, how do we think about all these things as the creative God who comes, takes you, and has you do a specific thing in the places that God has put you? That's been the work that I've done there as a ministry outworking of the nature of my theology. In 1998, 99, I did a postdoc at Regent College. And that was the time I really started to get interested, actually a little bit earlier. In my other master's degree, I did a course on pastoral counseling and wrote a paper on the church as a dysfunctional family. And it was really introduced to family systems thinking, attachment theory, and things like that. And so that gave me, in a sense, some tools for taking Trinitarian theology and asking, how does the church function in a way that is not defaulting to all kinds of human-based agendas that make for dysfunctional families? And so I started to practice that as a therapist in 2020. So I've been going over 22 years now. And I've worked, mostly with families and couples. I have done some individual. I've also worked with church staff and other groups like that to work through issues as well. And again, all of it, I work out of a theological paradigm in doing that. So I'm quite overt, even with, in some cases, a Christian wife and a non-Christian husband. I say who I am, and in the end, they said, I've never had anybody treat me with so much dignity and respect as what I felt sitting with you. So anyway, that's all just living the theology and the tenor of how one does what they do.
So that bridging of the Torrancian theology, Trinitarian theology, and practical theology and ministry seems to be characteristic of the face-to-face series as well, don't you think? As well as your own.
It definitely is. And there's a chapter in the third book on particularly on family systems and the Trinity. So I mean, in some cases they get quite overt in this series on that.
Mm-hmm. And just to clarify, so I didn't mishear, what was the year that you started the family and marriage therapy ministry?
I started as a therapist really in 2000, 99, 2000, right in there.
99, 2000, great. All right, that's a really interesting set of experiences to frame a holistic approach to science that you're presenting in chapter 3. Before we descend to just focus on chapter 3 specifically, maybe you could tell us briefly about the 3 books in the face-to-face series and how they fit together. The first you describe in the preface as discussing our disconnection, and the second as focused on reconnection. And so how would you describe this volume and the way it fits in the series?
Yeah, the first sentence of each of them, the first book is something is missing, the second one is something is possible, and the third one is something is already here. So the first one, in a sense, is the doctrine of sin in a relational mode. So it's just talking about the nature of how disconnected we are from God and one another, and how we fill that with addictions. I have a whole language of addiction therapy and so forth that are part of that as well. But just recognizing that sin is not just something that's wrong with us, it's something that's relationally broken in how we relate to God and one another. And so the second one, that something is possible, is just really learning a language of how relationships work, that the language even of truth. We tend to think of truth as a concept, but to say truth is a person and a way of being in relation to that person, to be true to one another. So the second book really is the possibility of thinking in a way that God has provided in his own way of being towards us, that engages us as beings in relation. The third one then, sharing God's life, it is my most complete kind of theology. It really follows kind of a Torrancian model of, how do we come to know that which can be known in the world, particularly the knowing of persons, again, just leading into the whole direction of how do we get distracted by what I would call forms of natural theology and projection and all those ways that we come up with things that we call God, but they're just a reflection of our culture, to then be able to understand the nature of knowing God who speaks to us, the whole language of voice and heart, which not a lot of theology books talk about the heart of God. And the voice of God, people get very uncomfortable with that as well. So I really attempt to play into the whole scriptural sense of man shall not live by bread alone, but by every word that proceeds from the mouth of God, that there's a sense of dynamic of voice. The sheep know the shepherd's voice. And I just assume there's a dynamic of personal being that is present, that we need a theology that leads us to hear, to know, and to know that we are known. And so the final 6 chapters really lead into this whole life of, what is the relationship and how does it really look like with the God revealed in the person of Christ.
All right. I hope everyone's PDF included the table of contents so you can see the titles of the 3 parts and the titles of the 10 chapters. And thank you for that overview of how they flow together.
The other thing just to say is the whole thing, I just sat one day and asked, what are all the aha moments I had in my life? And in a sense, that was the framework of what I did. So I didn't, allow for there to be a structure to be brought to it other than the process of discovery, which is a good Torrancian model, that life is full of wonder and the discovery process is what good science is all about. So that, in a sense, is how I chose to kind of develop how the argument unfolded.
Yeah, I like that personal approach. It does make it effective. So chapter 3 begins with some telling anecdotes about your undergraduate courses in science. And back in the preface, you mentioned that your own story is, quote, a dynamic element of the book. And right there, as we start off in chapter 3, that's evident. So would you like to tell us about your experiences with science and faith growing up all the way until your graduate study in theology?
Right. We'll try and do a quick summary of that. So to say, I'm the fourth of 6 kids in a family where my dad was a scientist. He taught physical science at Roosevelt High School in Seattle. My mom was the daughter of a Salvation Army family. And so she was all heart, all care and concern for people, loved Jesus. My dad started out of the church, but in the late 70s talked about converting out of the church because of his scientific convictions. So the whole thing of what he called his empirical orientation, if he couldn't see it, then he was not compelled to believe it. The simplest argument is most likely to be true, and all that became for him what directed him. And so I entered into a life of not being able to really take him on an argument at that point, but he was always in the back of my mind as I went on to do then my theological studies and really the nature of what it is that I've attempted to commit myself to as being a person who's focused on the nature of being persons, but to recognize that the nature of science is not something to be dismissed. It is something to be understood, appreciated, and appropriately undertaken in such a way that we include the life of the personal rather than seeing them as needing to be kept separately. So when I have gone through science courses, I'm always asking the question about the nature of methodology as much as the nature of just the content. So I did take a geology course. Kerry, you have a great appreciation for that at the same school that I mentioned in this first chapter here, or chapter 3 at the beginning, Shoreline Community College. But the nature, it was my favorite geology class because it so engaged the real. It was so much engaged in understanding the story of the world and the nature of how we look at it and hear the story that may not be obvious unless you are given eyes to see it. And so even in that geology class, there was a formation of how I see the world that wasn't true in my chemistry class, my physics class, and classes like that. So there's something about the way I was being formed to think about what science provides in knowing, understanding, engaging the world that was part of the process that was there. But at Shoreline, there was certainly an anti-Christian sentiment in those days. And I think it's still there. Just last week, somebody said, in Seattle, you really can't talk in public places about being a Christian or you will be shot down. I guess I'm not in those public places because I don't have the same experience, but these are people who are professional Christians, in Seattle, and they find that it is not a comfortable place to affiliate with being a Christian. So the nature of that whole sense of recognizing there are a lot of foolish things Christians say. And I really remember the first day in physical anthropology that the professor took the whole period to take one of those Schick publications that was trying to argue for the foolishness of evolution. And he just, spent the whole time taking that apart. And it was quite obvious he was an evangelist. And what he wanted to do is to turn people to a scientific way of thinking that turned people from their Christianity. So that was in a sense, quite an awakening just to the militancy of what science can be and the foolishness of what Christians can do in trying to put forward a view of the world and who God is that is going to be dismissed quickly. And so that, in my own formation, then led me to always be cautious and careful and try and honor both sides and listen for the best and move towards what Torrance would call good scientific thinking, where the nature of the other shapes the nature of that which we conclude our ongoing discovery in the process of speaking truthfully about something and believing there's a ton that we're going to miss and need to keep developing. So that kind of open dynamic space. For me, the whole nature, in a sense, even of doing marriage and family therapy, the nature of how I engage people, the skills that I picked up, I've translated into somewhat of a Torrancean engaging the strata of what's going on and learning to delve, deeper and deeper into the strata of what's going on, and then to ask the question about, what does it mean to live in a loving response to the nature of that which we find. It really is all Torrance methodology that's been translated into a mode of thinking and engaging that has to have a language that people can quickly engage. But that's what I'm trying to do, is to bring them into that life of articulate love for them that allows them to see and hear and know this other with whom their challenges are. And it is science, but it feels profoundly personal. And that's, there is that kind of the integration piece of what it is that I do.
Yes, that's a very compelling story, Marty, especially about the contrasting your parents and for so many Christians entering that kind of undergraduate experience would be tempted just to abandon their faith or to become completely anti-science. Yeah. And your ability to turn your respect and honoring and love for your father and your to a compassion, to something where you would respect science, but also bring the care of your mother to bear as well, is so obvious in this. I appreciate the way you frame the chapter in the preface and in the caption to part 2, which is on page 57. Let me find that. You speak there of a broader science that engages all of life and enables us to live in relation to all that is around us. So instead of just reacting against science, your quest has been for a broader vision that would accommodate what is good in science that you could see, and those you love who were devoted to science, even if their vision was too narrow, and to see if there might be some theological vision that could anchor natural science in a broader vision. In the preface, you said, quote, "Believing that the world is the only appropriate object for observation misses the world of the personal. Personal knowing requires methods appropriate to our personal nature," end quote. And that's to introduce the whole book, but it seems like this chapter on science is faith and faith and science really belongs in the book as part of that overall quest.
The one thing my dad ever came to hear me do was I did a three-week series, 3 Wednesday nights on Dawkins. Dawkins was his favorite person. And my attempt wasn't to put Dawkins down, but to begin, Dawkins is pursuing truth, and the nature of what I'm trying to do is pursuing truth. How do we pursue truth well? So I looked for points to explore that. And when I was done, he said, well, that was very interesting. He had no pushback. And he recognized that what I was trying to do is to really create a conversation where we could hear each other and look for ways to find meeting points rather than divergence, and to build the wall or the gulf between.
Oh, we pray that was seeds of reconciliation that were planted there in that experience.
Yes.
Throughout this chapter, throughout chapter 3, you develop a portrait that's all too common among those undergraduate science teachers and among many in our culture, of a dualism between science and faith. So for example, on page 60, you talk about a split in knowing the world. And you have the phrase, the rise of science meant the end of religion, as if the relation between science and religion is a zero-sum game. That's a common caricature of what secularization means. That Charles Taylor calls that a subtraction account. When one goes up, the other must go away. At which I think most historians would say that doesn't work historically, but it's a dynamic that many people buy into. So in this sadly prevalent viewpoint, this dualism between the two, throughout the chapter, you drop here and there characteristics when they're set opposed in this way of both science and religion, maybe we could put some of those on the table. What are the characteristics of science and religion that people who see them as exclusive options opposed to one another understand them by? Let's just throw some of those out to get those as a starting point for what we want to integrate.
Well, for my dad, I have a brother, he's my younger brother. If I can't see it, and if you can't prove it through something you can put in front of me, then I can't believe it. So the seeing is believing image. I had another friend who about a year ago said, I just don't believe in imaginary friends. And so I think there is this sense, you're making it all up. It's serving something about that, fulfill something in your weakness, but it seems unnecessary. And for other family members, I have an ex-brother-in-law who he felt that the history of Christianity particularly had been the scourge of the world, that, the Crusades and the oppression of science where he saw it happen, that he had an ongoing litany that he loved to bring out and just poke at me. So there is this sense of how one reads history, how one reads the natural world, how one reads the experience of Christians that they have known, that really isn't doing very good theological work. But it appears to those people, those who are Christians are not educated. They don't understand the damage that's been done, is being done. And so, all these things are what I have had brought out in the circle of, family and acquaintances who have had that pushback piece.
Boy. I'm reminded of those surveys that say, who would you rather have as a neighbor? And evangelical Christians are at the very bottom, of the list. So
yes.
We've got a lot of work to do, don't we?
I would just point out that there is a postscript. It was a bit of a Kierkegaardian move. The book has concluding postscript for agnostics. And so my intent was to begin with somebody to assume that they were agnostic and just to say, why should you read this book or believe anything? And I started out saying, it is not necessary to believe in God. Many people do quite well in life without believing in God. So the fact that you don't believe in God, that's okay. But then I go on, it is not impossible to believe in God. And I move more in a planting it section. I won't go the whole thing, but I just begin to play out, how does one think in a world where there are these necessities that are upon us, that science is, you've got to believe this or you're a fool, versus what are the possibilities of how one really understands a world that includes the personal, which for most people, their personal relationships really are what's most important. But we've done such a poor job, I think, of really learning the language of that, learning the skills of what it looks like to negotiate, to compromise, to work together and building a relationship rather than one person being in control. So many people they feel like either they're going to give up control or there's somebody in control of them that they can't push back against. So we have so much of a challenge there that theology and the church just doesn't seem to provide an answer for those people who are dealing with those challenges, not to mention the traumas that people are experiencing, the addictions that people are wrestling with. There's just so much of that the church right now, it just seems like if all this theology is working, the church would be at the forefront of really being there in the neighborhoods of our country, coming alongside and helping people to walk through this pandemic. But I see occurrences where that is happening, but there are samples that are bright spots in a large field of missing opportunities.
Yeah. Boy, that's a good one. And the personal versus impersonal dualism, that one is certainly aligned with it as well, where people think of personal as the private and the subjective and the speculative and the black box of the individual. And that's where religion belongs. Whereas science, it almost has authority due to its impersonality.
Yeah.
And what a damaging thing for science itself when our brightest, our most creative, bright students get turned off on a career in science because it's presented to them as such an impersonal, mechanical kind of activity. I think that especially it plays a role in dissuading women and other minorities from pursuing science as well.
Yeah.
A problem at the heart of science education in this country.
John McMurray makes a statement that our first philosophical move is to ask the question, is the universe personal or is it impersonal? I.e., is there a sense of creativity that brings meaning and purpose to it, or is there not? Because if there isn't, everything we do is just created by ourselves. Yeah. But if there is meaning in the universe that explains why we are persons, then we would do well to engage a science of the personal, to understand what it means to operate in a manner that is true to the nature of that. So for me, that is a very compelling thought. That's the last chapter of Persons in Relation, John McMurray.
Oh, that's fantastic. In a way, this whole chapter is a wonderful prelude to diving into McMurray, I would say.
Yeah.
Yeah. So there are other descriptions of this caricature of the opposition of science and religion that one can glean from your chapter that you touch on here and there. A few that I noted are private versus public, no evidence versus evidence. You've said that, imaginary friends, speculation versus facts, subjective versus objective, arbitrary beliefs versus certain knowledge, divisive versus uniting, anger versus dispassionate reasoning, and there are others. So yeah. You pick up on so many aspects of this dualism between science and faith as they are generally understood in our culture. And then, yet in this introductory section of your chapter, your burden is to suggest an alternative approach of faith-seeking understanding that integrates the two. On the top of page 61 is where you get into that, and a long footnote on the bottom. Would you like to comment on what you mean by faith-seeking understanding?
Right. Well, it's a huge, it's a short little statement that often I think people think, faith, you've got to go without any reasoning. I mean, this is what I'm trying to overcome. Without any reasoning, you have to begin to believe something, and then something good will come out of that. So it's kind of like, trust me, and it'll all work out for you. Which I saw a movie once that said, if anybody says, trust me, then say that, my mom always said, if somebody says to you, trust me, don't trust them. Those are the ones not to trust, because they're saying that they're not trustworthy, and you're going to have to suspend all trust in order to trust them. So as I unpack here to say the nature of trust or faith that seeks understanding is to acknowledge that there is something there. So if I have faith that you are there, Kerry, then I can say, Kerry, tell me about yourself, and I can listen because I have faith that you are there. And if I have faith that you will tell me true things about yourself or answer in a way that is true to the nature of what you know, then my faith will grow, and I will understand not only you, but all those things that you are an entryway into understanding. If I, from the very beginning, say, oh, he's a Christian and he's a scientist, I can't trust you if I have no faith in you, I will understand nothing. Though I'm sitting with you, that I see you, though I hear your words, I will have no understanding because I have not entered into the place where faith is possible. I talk often about, if you want to take a bus, you go to the bus schedule, and if you trust the bus schedule, then you're going to go and wait for the bus at the time that it says it's there. But if you don't trust the bus schedule, you won't even look at the schedule to go get ready to catch the bus. So that is the faith that leads you to understand how you're going to achieve the whole life that will unfold from it. So the faith point here is really to recognize that we have the ability to just deny all things, to try and, I would say, out of fear to protect ourselves, means that we trust no one else. And to begin to trust the nature of persons, our car, all those things, all of them, we have to develop a relationship of trust in order to engage and live within what opens up when that faith relationship is established. So to say faith here is anything but a leap in the dark it is that awareness that one has even as an infant, that this one who I later will call mother and father, hopefully they're there, that they loved me, they cared for me, and they nurtured faith in me. And so when they said, this will hurt you and that will be good for you, I was willing to listen because the faith had been established. And through what McMurray calls the discernment of the other, they helped me to learn in life how to recognize those things that were good for me and those things that were not. And that is a faith process where I come to discern, which I would use the word science there. I learn the science of how do I engage the world? How do I understand so that I can make choices within it that will be for the good of my relationships, as well as what it is that I choose to do in finding the contribution that I have to make in the world. So faith is a very relational term that acknowledges and appropriately responds, almost katafusen, we get put here. Even when you come out of the womb, you're already in the process of not necessarily choosing in a sense at that point, but we do learn to push things away or to accept, and that is even the process of coming to faith there.
Thanks, Marty. There are so many aspects of what you've just said that we'll return to as we continue our discussion, one of which is the interchanging of the word faith and trust so that we don't have just a mental abstract concept of what faith means.
Right.
And that faith is relational as is trust. In the footnote here, I'm so pleased to see that you mentioned Augustine and Anselm and Karl Barth as well as commentary on Anselm. In the middle of that long footnote, you say, which is perfectly obvious to someone who's thought about faith-seeking understanding, but I think it's a shock to so many. Christianity is an evidence-based faith that begins with the givens of the world. Because with this faith-seeking understanding, faith is a turning outward, as I understand you saying, to the reality or the givens of the world. Denying oneself, repenting from just one's prior commitments. It's an openness to being in faithful relation to the reality that surrounds us. And so we start with that relationship with reality, we entrust ourselves to it, and we seek to understand it. It's a quite different perspective on what faith is. That's, I think, at the heart of the biblical tradition and the Christian tradition. Faith and reason have been discussed every century since Aristotle, who said that it is irrational to try to argue with someone who denies first principles. Mm-hmm. And for Aristotle, those first principles have multiple origins, but some of them are the givens of the reality that we experience. Mm-hmm. And faith-seeking understanding is an integration of faith and science. I had a professor, my first semester in the history of science graduate program here at OU. He was a noted paleontologist who had converted to history of science and philosophy of science late in his career. And I remember him pounding on the table in a seminar and saying, "There's no reasoning without monstrous presuppositions." And one of his great articles that I love so much said, it began, the first sentence, "By itself, a fossil tells us nothing, not even that it is a fossil." So he was certainly of the persuasion that in science, as in religion, the process is one of faith-seeking understanding.
Yeah. An interesting side note on my dad, though he became, what he called a fairly hardened agnostic, he still had a temperament that was always, he was the son of a Presbyterian minister, and so he'd been raised in the church, and he had a profound propensity to help people. And he would help them with their cars and something wrong in their house. And my sister-in-law, who's Jewish, said, "I think your dad left Christianity, but I don't know that it left him." Yeah. All of his inclinations still come from his Christian orientation. And he had memorized a number of Psalms when he was young and hymns. And he would recite Psalms and you'd see a tear running down his cheek.
Oh, wow.
And I just had to say, there's something in his brain that has separated, but there's something deeper in him that has not left him.
Yes.
Right. And so it's, to whisk him into the arms of God when he did die in 2015, I had a sense, because of my Torrance training, you may be resisting God outwardly or in your brain, but that God is waiting for you and still knows your heart. And in your heart, I think you will have a heart re-engagement from long ago that will find its proper reorientation.
Yes, who we are is different from just what we say we believe.
Yeah.
That's poignant and compelling. Thank you for sharing that, Marty.
Yeah.
And, maybe that's a good segue to this marvelous quote of Einstein's on page 63. Of course, you've cited Einstein a number of times. This one on page 63 is one of my all-time favorite quotes by him. I'll go ahead and read it, and then maybe you can briefly comment on it.
Yeah.
You introduce it by saying, properly understood, faith and science should not be separated. Again, there's a unity or integration between them, not a dualism. As Einstein said, quote, now, even though the realms of religion and science in themselves are clearly marked off from each other, nevertheless, there exist between the two strong reciprocal relationships and dependencies. Though religion may be that which determines the goal, it has nevertheless learned from science in the broadest sense what means will contribute to the attainment of the goals it has set up. But science can only be created by those who are thoroughly imbued with aspiration towards truth and understanding. This source of feeling, however, springs from the sphere of religion. And he's saying right there that science springs from religion. To this, there also belongs the faith in the possibility that the regulations valid for the world of existence are rational, that is, comprehensible to reason. I cannot conceive of a genuine scientist without that profound faith. The situation may be expressed by an image. Science without religion is lame. Religion without science is blind.
There's a ton there to unpack, but because it touches on so many things that are true to Einstein, but John McMurray, in a sense, took some of these things even further. For McMurray, religion is the foundational way of being in the world, of knowing the world. Art is one of the three, and I think Einstein also used the three of science, art, and religion. So the personal is most foundational. We, in art, reflect as persons on the objective world and reflect on it, and also have an element of personal expression about our emotion or relation to the world. So much of Western culture has art as a way of interpreting the nature of reality, that it is part of the personal dimension. When art is done well, it furthers what he would call a religious intuition, i.e., to truly respect and honor the other as person, God and human beings. The nature of science is a knowledge of the impersonal world in such a way that we reflect on it, ask the question of our relation to it, and to not merely see it as something that is purely impersonal, but that there's a sense of our relation to it is one that even there is a place of care for what is properly done, which when one properly cares for creation, guess what? That's religion also, because we're caring for the world that God has made. So religion is the fulfillment of the human intuitions of reflective knowing that allows us to live knowingly in the world in ways that are appropriate both to human existence as well as the impersonal, or what we'll call the natural world. So the nature of what Einstein is laying out here is to say, in every case here, we are persons. How we orient ourselves in our relation to the dynamic of that which we engage. We need religion to truly see persons as persons. People often say, when I say, there is no science of the personal, I say, well, what about psychology? And I say, have you read the DSM-5? it reduces persons to symptoms. And there's a checklist of usually 7 different criteria that one must do that objectively will qualify this person for having that disorder. And then you proceed on that, and the insurance company requires that objectivity to be able to work with something. But the very structure of psychology is that it deals with the thoughts, feelings, and behaviors of an individual, objectively separate from other people. The DSM-5, which insurance pays, if you don't want insurance, you could do something otherwise, which is what I do. But otherwise, you have to treat people as an object with criteria that they have a dysfunction. So you basically mechanize them to fit into the psychological formula. And so I say psychology is still a science that has not yet discovered the field of the personal. And that's why people like Ray Anderson's work and others who are theologians to do something that moves us in that direction is a helpful move to bring together what Einstein's talking about here, the integration of science and faith appropriate to the nature of how we care for persons that have both a thoughtful psychological dimension to them, but it is lived in relation to others, and that physiology plays into all that as well. That to take one part, it's all part of what I call, this will be in the first chapter of my book, The Science of the Personal, the great splitting headache. The dualism, when you take science and faith and do in part, you're either you're gonna miss something, and it's gonna be significant enough that the whole will fall apart. If you choose either just science or just faith without acknowledging the other, it will give you a headache trying to live as a full human being in the world. So the nature of Einstein is the reintegration of the nature of fully seeing that we are humans in all of the field understanding, the relativity that requires an understanding of what Torrance likes to talk about as the duality of our being. Of course, we have thoughts in our head, and our thoughts are about the world. And of course, we're physical beings in the world. So we have to have a full-bodiedness and full-mindedness to function as persons in relation in the world. And that if we have religion without science, then we won't be able to see or understand the nature of what the world is that we live in. And so we will become foolish. If we have science without faith, we will assume that there are no values that are there. But as Polanyi particularly says, every scientist values one discipline within science over another. And that value means they're going to pay attention to something and neglect other things, like maybe their family. Not that all scientists neglect their family, but whenever you choose one thing, you will neglect other things, unless you have an orientation that says, I'm part of a big family and I will listen to all of the different scientists and we will learn together, including the theological scientists, right? And when I was at the University of Otago, I sat down with a faculty within the University of Otago. I was teaching Greek and a few other things there. And I told him what I did, and he just said, isn't that era all done? Hasn't the God of the gaps made obsolete what it is that you claim to do? Mm. And, that was the first point that I really sat with a professional academic. And that was kind of the thinking there. I was at Regent actually with somebody who was talking about science and faith. And he also did psychology. And he had a similar kind of statement that we need to keep faith and science kind of separate because it'll pollute the what it is that psychology is trying to do. And it's like, you just don't understand what Einstein was trying to say, that you cannot do the one without the other appropriately.
Yeah. So we have these two different conceptions of science. One is that it's something altogether opposed to faith or religion, and the other that they're integrated in some way, some profound way, not a simple way, but profound ways. And that's a good segue then into the next section, which is simply titled Science. Everything that's come to this point has been, I think, introducing the themes that are going to be now examined in a slightly more focused way in the next 4 sections. First, we have a section on science, then a section on faith, then science as faith, and then faith as science. So we're kind of revisiting what we've said, but the section on science, starting on page 64, begins with three myths of science. First, that science is impartial and impersonal. Second, that it's the final word. And third, that science alone can save us or provide meaning and guidance for life. And that, of course, is to go contrary to what you've just built up in this introduction of a person. We live in a personal world, not just a natural world, but a personal. Yeah. There's personal reality, and goes contrary to what Einstein said there.
I also try and trip the person up with the first line. We can know God scientifically. The reason it trips it up is because people bring up immediately a natural science form of it. I assume they haven't probably read Torrance yet.
Yeah.
To know that the nature of science is the katafusen, to understand the nature of the other, it means appropriate to the nature of that which one studies. Which again, where did Torrance get that idea from? Many people, but the particular formulation of that and reason came from my good friend, whose birthday was yesterday, John McMurray.
All right. Yes.
Great, so say science, we have to really bring into the fore, how do we use the word science appropriately to what science might mean in its best use?
Right.
So we can set it up as a fenced discipline where there's no interaction and no conversation, or we can say it is the nature of humans involved in the process of knowing the world in which they exist in all of its dimensions. Mm-hmm. And if we choose to fence off the personal from the impersonal, it's kind of like having half a brain.
Very good. Yeah, that is a great opening line. We can know God scientifically, but not within a narrow definition of science. Fitting with your thrust throughout the whole chapter consistently, we need a broader vision on what science is. And on the top of page 65, a more general science began when Adam and Eve took on the task of naming the animals, you write. Would you like to comment on how naming the animals illustrates what a broader general understanding of science would be?
Right. Well, in two different senses there, when you say this is a dog and this is a cat, in naming them, you can tell them apart then in the same way that a child learns. At first, everything is just you grunt a noise and you point for something to drink, and then you come to say milk, and then you say orange juice, and then you get to the point where you say, I'd like a 1972 Cabernet Sauvignon Blanc. And there's a coming to distinguish that is more and more accurate about the nature of the world in which one lives, and therefore your ability to relate to it. But when you call that dog Cooper, which was the name of our dog, there's a personal relationship that's established in the naming of it as well. So the nature of naming, it's not just pure science in the sense of creating phylums and species and so forth like that. There's a sense that the human is called into relationship with the world and called to say, these are things you're going to be relating to. And so we need to be able to understand, what these beings are and what your role is as caregiver. And so much of what the language of dominion, I always read the nature of caregiver, the nature of steward, all those kinds of things. Well, a steward needs to understand how do we relate to all these things that we're supposed to take care of? And how do we develop patterns or name patterns that are helpful in that stewarding process?
Yeah, that's great. And it goes back to what we were talking about, embracing the givenness of reality as well, doesn't it? That a posture of faith is one that is openness to a reality that is other than oneself.
Yes.
And so on page 67, I love this formulation. You say, constructive science is a faith-filled investigation of what is yet unknown, equipped with tools to glimpse a bit further into vast mysteries. And that approach to science, embracing the totality of what is given, the totality of reality to explore, that's a healing of the cultural split, that kind of broader vision.
The little phrase "proceed with wonder" is a phrase that I use thinking in science. How do I proceed? And so using Google and things like that. When I teach biblical studies, I often will talk about entering into the study of a book of proceeding with wonder. I wonder what that means. I wonder what this connects to. I wonder what God is saying here. When sitting with one spouse in the morning drinking coffee, if you proceed with wonder, I wonder what you're doing today, dear. I wonder what's happening in your schedule. You know, what are you looking forward to, and what do you have some concerns about? That wonder is part of the science of really living into the moment, the mystery of the moment with wonder, that really is fulfilling what I would call the best of practical science in action.
Yeah. Wonder isn't where there are gaps. The old God of, God of the gaps paradigm that you referred to, a faith-seeking understanding approach imbues everything with wonder. Excuse me. Would it be helpful to add the qualifier natural to science when we refer to the natural sciences?
There is
elaborate on that while I get it.
Well, you joke, yeah. And we have some comments coming up too that we want to respond to. But the word natural, I mean, at one time, the word natural philosophy was used as a term to refer to a world that is there. If we work with Polanyi that all science is personal, i.e., there's always a person involved in doing the work of science, then I think that there may be a value in distinguishing those things. And Torrance will talk about, knowing a fish, a cow, and a tree, and the difference of knowing each of those, and then knowing, of course, a person, a human person, and then knowing God. There are similarities, but in all of them, the common denominator is that we are knowing them. And so that whole discrimination of the other becomes part of the nature of how we see them as a different thing. But to use John McMurray's sense of the field of the personal, there is what he calls resistance and acceptance. So if the fish happens to be a barracuda or a piranha, then the nature of, there's that fish will get me, that it's more than just naming it as a species, or it's a shark and you're swimming off the beaches of Australia. There's a sense in which my relationship is quite different to it than if it's a fish that I have in my pond, a koi that my local raccoon keeps eating, where I recognize the raccoon likes to eat that. And so there's something about the nature of knowing not only what that animal or what that tree is, and does it bear fruit that I can eat, or is that poisonous and I need to be careful with my kids being around it, that there's a dimension of in the scientific process, I am knowing this not only to name it, but to have a relationship with it. And it's true of all these objects. So if I use the word nature of what's going on, it hasn't taken out the overarching sense that I'm trying to understand its nature in nature by virtue of the kind of relationship I can have with it. And that science really does serve humanity and humanity serving God. If I know that something's going to hurt somebody or kill them, then I do well to take care of them by helping them to avoid the animal, the tree, the food, or whatever that is going to be damaging to them. So it's interrelatedly quite complex for me as to how all those things work. Did I answer your question?
Yes, you sure did. Hey, Bruce, would you like to jump in and...
He can't talk.
Is your microphone still not fixed? Okay, all right. Bruce has contributed a wonderful comment in the chat. Yeah. Deriving from Bruce's study of James Clerk Maxwell. What did Maxwell mean in referring to man as the, quote, appointed Lord over the works of creation, end quote? He was alluding to Genesis 1:26 through 28, which states that humanity has been given dominion over the earth. Maxwell interpreted that as a curatorship. The curator of an exhibition provides interpretation of the objects, giving sense to the whole. In a similar way, humanity interprets the created order, giving sense to it by discovering the laws which its author has embedded within it. This is close to what Karl Barth And Thomas F. Torrance later expressed that man is the creature set on the boundary between heaven and earth, through whom the created order comes to know itself, and in so doing offers the worship of all creation back to God. And
Amen.
I
love the word curator. I love art docent is another. I mean, and if we say curator is the scientist, art docent is the artist, then we as theologians and pastors and all that, we should have a similar kind of mode of helping people to have this sense of interpreting the world in such a way that we live in response to it out of a worship for God, which if you ever saw J.B. Torrance in a meadow on Hurricane Ridge, filled with flowers, dancing and singing to the glory of God, you would know that he was a theologian, but he was fully enraptured by the beauty and creativity of God as was displayed in many, many different forms. So, and I think Karl Barth's listening to Mozart, in a sense, was similar. He was a docent. He was a curator of the beauty of God in ways that expanded beyond what we would think of as hard, cold theology, but it moved him from the very center of his being, and in a sense created some of the rhythms of what became the church dogmatics. I happen to be working in those opening sections of the third volume of the church dogmatics in my Bart series on Genesis there, and Bart really has the sense of the whole theological underpinning of how we look at God's involvement in the role of the human, the covenant that is being established as God creates a world that we're supposed to be serving the world. We're made from the earth, but we're made to serve the earth. I mean, even we shouldn't see ourselves as entirely superior to it. We're made to serve and to care, even in the role for which God made us, as a fulfillment of the covenant with God, to be caretakers of the earth and to honor who God is as the creator of heaven and earth. So there's so much that's in that wonderful statement you've made there, Bruce. And I wish the church. I actually have an art gallery at the church that I go to, and people say, why do you have a seminary with an art gallery? It's art is just such a wonderful opportunity to reflect on how we reflect on the world that God has made, and the nature of artists that see the beauty and feel moved by God, or reflecting God's beauty, or noticing the brokenness in the world. I had one person who works with addicts in the streets of Vancouver, British Columbia, and all of her art is around the brokenness of humanity with redemptive themes that come in. And it's a beautiful interplay of the theology of God being played out in art. She's a docent in a creative process of making visible the hand of God in all of that work.
That's wonderful. And I have to confess, I'm partial to the word curator as well, Bruce, because of the etymological dimension of caring for, conserving, preserving. And that effort includes the docenting, the teaching, but it also includes ensuring that it is properly interpreted in a way that endures to future generations. So without its preservation, the interpretation would not be successful either.
I would love it if pastors saw themselves as curators whose job was to bring out the gifts of all the people, to curate the gifts of the people, that they might feed the whole congregation week after week of knowing and being known, and using their gifts in ways that build up that congregation, and that then spills out into the community in the ways where the curative work becomes, as you've said, a saving, not saving in the sense of getting people converted, so much as transforming the community by virtue of who they've become, because people have been released into their ways of being out of the love of God, for the love of others, and for the neighborhood.
And Al, thank you for your comment that it seems to me that God's native language is mathematics. I follow that up with the famous quote from Galileo along those lines. And as many of you know, I'm curator of a history of science collections, which includes all of the first editions of the 12 books that Galileo wrote. as well as many others. And so I've just now put a link into the page about a Galileo exhibit I curated about 6 years ago now that included the book that is from. And then if we had Francis Collins here, he would tell us about his book, The Language of God, in which DNA is the language for someone working in certain fields of biology. And we might, if we had Polanyi or Torrance here, they might talk about the multi-leveled character of reality, each level having its own language. And
Torrance also talked about word and number, that each one is needed to interpret within the realm of what's there, and they interpenetrate one another in a sense.
Very good, yes. And then Dwayne, you have a comment as well. I use faith seeking understanding, but also a lower order, I believe, in order to know. Yes, I believe in order to know. And think back to the statement of, I believe, Lord, help me in my unbelief. The Logos mediates the knowledge and understanding to us in the physical and spiritual. I love that. Al, Dwayne, Marty, any comments on those, on what you've said in chat, or want to go further?
Sometimes it just feels like we're at the beginning of such a huge adventure that people feel like, we've kind of reached some kind of an end. But I think when you really begin to think in these kinds of ways, there is just so much to be discovered. And so that's where I get kind of excited and frustrated. The frustration is that there seem to be so few who are willing to be in the grand adventure of discovering all that is possible to open up. The encouragement is that it's so exciting discovering all the things as they open up. And to value those who love numbers and those who love words. And in the realm of words, there's whole fields. I mean, who would think about somebody doing attachment therapy as a theologian, that those would go together, or to understand addictions, the nature of addiction, as really opening up how we understand the nature of God and who God is in the world, and what happens when God is not allowed to curate the nature of what a flourishing life looks like. So for me, they all just open up avenues of exploration in a world that is desperately in need of some people to be creatively involved in that curatorship of the life that God intends for us. So the opportunity is huge. The challenge is huge.
Yeah, actually, I just want to comment something in terms of faith and science. John McKenna was taught by John Wheeler at Princeton. That was his connection to the faith and science, and why he really got along with Torrance, and worked with Philopatus and stuff like that. And he was like, and this is where some of this language is coming from. He was working on this integration or interface, like I was saying, where he was thinking this stuff through, where in order for the Logos is going back to the language that we use to learn how to articulate and enunciate, he was working on that understanding of how it is. All things are held together by the word of his power, and this reality where, he was convinced, in his wonder and his just respect for the great I am, that he made this stuff knowable, and he's disclosed, like what was that, Psalm 19? I forgot how the beginning of that psalm goes, where the creation is there. And it's like one of those things where the secret things of the Lord are for him, but the things he's given to man for us to access and interpret and be aware of and discover truth and discover reality, that's for us, and it's there's another, I think it's another psalm there where he says, the secret of the Lord with those who fear him. And another translation is, the friendship of the Lord is with those who fear him. And yet in his friendship, he reveals whatever your curiosity, whether it's on the physical plane or the spiritual plane, there's so much knowledge and truth in his unveiling and revealing of himself that, he has to give you that revealedness content for it to stick with you, so you can figure out what it is you're trying to explain. And sometimes that takes a while, because, John told me, he goes, You need to have yourself 2 or 3 generations of kids so you can start working on this stuff.
Yes. Thank you for that, Dwayne.
Bruce has another comment.
Yeah, so Bruce, thank you for that comment. The first part is, did any of us come to faith through a God of the gaps type of argument? It was something else, God's own witness to himself. I couldn't agree more. I doubt that any of us really have or would disagree. And that fits the principle that faith is an opening of ourselves up to reality. And then in the case of theology, it's God who speaks. Reality speaks to us. He witnesses to himself. But in the natural sciences, the faith that's involved in the natural sciences is also an opening of ourselves up to the realities being studied as they're disclosed to us. So while it's different in that there's no comparison to being in front of a God who speaks. Nevertheless, when we are scientists, we are opening ourselves up to a reality other than ourselves. And there's a role for repentance, even in natural science, as we correct our preconceptions. But so to me, that's a quick comparison. That is a partial answer to your last question. Does that create a gap between the physical scientist and the theological scientist when they interdiscuss? And on a practical level, I think there's no question that that's not well understood. But Bruce, would you like to put in the chat any further follow-up thoughts? And Marty, would you like to respond to that?
Yeah, I think, following Torrance's, quote unquote, nude natural theology is really a theology of nature, that most of the work of noticing what we would consider gaps, i.e., where did DNA come from? Why is there life on this planet? The whole fine-tuned universe, all that. To use those arguments to argue that God exists is not as powerful as saying, having seen that God exists, to say there is life and that there is DNA, therefore there can be mutation and all of the developments, the coming of consciousness. And I mean, there's just so much that is profoundly miraculous that at one level are all God of the gap kinds of arguments. But once you recognize the God revealed in Jesus reveals the God who creates the universe, and it is orderly and contingent, and therefore there is a wisdom in seeing the nature of all that is created, and it all has a place within the conversation then of, how do we care for this world and one another in light of the contingency of seeing that it's been created by God's purpose for purposes that align with what it is that God does. But that's not a coming to faith. In a sense, though, I believe, help my unbelief. At some level, there is, I would hope that scientists who really understand the nature of God would live in continual amazement as they see, this follows from that and opens new doors. I think of Maxwell in discovering field theory, which TF says was because of his theological underpinnings that he could think in field kind of ways. But to keep asking questions, well, now that I see that, God exists in this dynamic way, how do I keep gaining eyes to see more of the nature of the world? So in a sense, in the broadest sense of how I'm using, he's coming to faith, i.e. he's coming to a greater sense of understanding the world, having faith that God has created all of these amazing dynamics. That is it's at least a deepening of faith. I don't think it's going from unfaith to faith necessarily, but it is coming to a faith that there comes a point where you just go, I have no other explanation that could work. Nothing else makes sense. To just say it's all a mistake, it's all by chance, just doesn't ring as something that feels like it could be true. It all just so makes sense in the one way. And so to say there is a deepening in the faith, that is not quite what your question was there, Bruce. But it is coming to the depth of faith in a way that I think is consistent with Torrance's understanding of natural theology. And natural theology is, in a sense, using the gaps of how we explain things to try and come up with a logic of how God might be. So to say natural theology is never a way that either Torrance or Barth will assume looking at human capacities and observing the natural world to reason our way to God is never an avenue that they will take. So in that sense, I would affirm your first part that we don't come to God through the God of the gaps. But once you discover the nature of the God who comes in the person of Christ, the evidence of God in coming, in revealing who God is, that the very deepening of what faith is, which I'm broadly twisting your phrase, coming to deep faith continues to grow as one discovers the world and the work of God in the creation, sustaining and furthering of it.
I believe Torrance somewhere uses the phrase doxological science. Sometimes he uses doxological as that foundational level of the daily experience of the theologian in the church, but for science as well, a doxological science.
Yeah, doxa is one of those words that, I wish there were more theological work done on the nature of the glory of God and the nature of what it is, how we speak, reflect, and live that out as our reflections on who God is and the glory of God in the world. It just seems like the word glory has become too much of a flashbulb and not enough of entering into the wonder and majesty of God who is present to us, who sustains the world that's amazing. And, we keep opening to that. The word needs to be restored to its proper theological depth.
Yeah. Marty, we have 3 more sections to go, but nevertheless, why don't you take a moment to go ahead and answer Al's question in chat.
Right.
And Al, you can ask it in person if you want to unmute, or Marty can just read it.
So the whole dualistic communities of religion and science and their attitude towards COVID-19 and vaccine, the world we live in right now, there are so many forms of religion, some of them that appear non-religious, where they have a religious-like fervor for a set of principles. I mean, it's kind of the worst sense of what religion might be, where people are so oriented to a particular agenda or a particular person or a particular sense of what it means to control one's own life, which they think is a religious agenda, that the very task of identifying what is really religion here and what is science, I've come to believe that there's not a lot of difference between a hyper fundamentalist Christian and a hyper fundamentalist science. Neither of them can hear anybody who disagrees with them. They're bound to a set of principles that can't hear or see the other as persons. They have a logic or reasonableness to them that makes them unable to hear or be open to finding ways to work with someone else. So all they can do is set up walls of self-protection or artillery to destroy the other. And so, all of those things I think are at play right now over COVID-19, that people at some level have lost sight that COVID-19 is even the issue. There's a collapsing into what I would call 2 forms of religion, one to the left and one to the right. Both of them are profoundly individualistic and not relational. Either one of them could be profoundly relational and really make a difference on finding ways to work together. But right now, the emotions of the polarity, which it comes from the great splitting headache, the dualism, we have the mind, i.e. the science communities, and the other saying, we have faith, God will take care of us and we have to defend our religious rights. And in both cases, I go, what was it in the movie, The Princess Bride? Somehow I don't think you understand what inconceivable or what it means to really know means. Because they each have their own limits in what they see that just can't allow them to recognize that we're going to keep living on this earth for a while together, and divide and conquer is still a true statement. And so, if we keep dividing, somehow we will either conquer ourselves or become weak and become conquered by others. But it is not a good path forward. And this is where, my hope for the church is that Well, as I say, when I start teaching on the doctrine of sin, needing to be right is the beginning point of the doctrine of sin. If you need to be right, then you're going to make somebody else wrong. Now you have a division and you're probably not going to get beyond it. So what is the right thing to do or think is always the wrong question. The biblical question is always, what is the loving thing to do? So if in our COVID response, we're asking the question, in this community, in this school, in this family, what is the loving thing to do to know and honor the people who are present in this space? How can our loving actions go forward for a period of time? And then we'll ask again, and what's the loving thing to do now? We'd be in a very different place from that. That's a relational orientation rather than a rational orientation that either the right or the left tend to default to. That was a not so short answer to your question. I don't know if it helped at all.
Thanks, Marty. Say, let's go quickly through the section on faith, because I think we've touched on it adequately so far, and I want to get to the last two sections, but I'll just point out two sentences at the beginning of this section, page 68, that I think summarize some of the points we've made already. Marty, you write, not only do we know God through faith, it is also how we know one another. And also we can say how we know reality, even in the natural sciences.
Absolutely.
And then the last paragraph on this page, rather, faith is the process of aligning our thoughts, feelings, and actions with the reality we inhabit. In adjusting our beliefs, in repentance if necessary, in trust and commitment, personal commitment. This openness to reality that we've been talking about as the posture of faith is something that you really bring to the surface in this section on faith as well.
In a sense, a summary of theological science.
Yeah, that's right. Okay, so now we have the two sections, Science is Faith, starting on page 70, and Faith is Science after that. And they do overlap a bit, but so our discussion of the two might bleed together. But first of all, in Science as Faith, you address really the question, what are the various ways that the natural sciences involve faith? And we've talked about that already a bit. And one is as a belief system, one is as trust and commitment and preconditions for inquiry. I believe in order that I might understand. And there's no dualism between faith and reason any more than between facts and values. So those are some of the things that you address in this section, Science and Faith. Marty, would you like to comment on this section, or does anyone have
one quick comment? I remember the day I wrote in my first book a chapter on if Jesus had written a book, the first chapter would have been about his Father, because he came to bring us to the Father, and no one comes to the Father but through me, and he came to exegete, the one who's the heart of the Father. So in there I wrote about God the Father, and then I talked about my own father and the way that he'd converted out of Christianity, and that he'd come to have faith in his empiricism. So I also in that section talked about a really transforming time in my relationship with my dad, who had an affair at one point for about 8 years, and nobody ever talked about it. One day I went and talked to him and talked about 3 hours about what had happened there with him. And so in the book, I talk about just, the transformation of just accepting who he was and what he'd been through. And, it's in my first book, it's pretty exposing. The thing that he came back on me on was that not what I had done in exposing him with his affair, it was that I called his empiricism a faith. And that's where it really awoke in me that it was such a deeply ingrained faith for him that he couldn't even see it as a faith. He couldn't see that his belief around that was really shaping everything else that he did and thought.
Yeah.
And so ever since then, I've really listened carefully to recognize someone may not be able to use the word faith. So I might say, it just sounds like you really believe this is true. And I'm not using the word faith. And sometimes, people will kind of get that. If you say, well, you have faith in this person, and you have faith in this teaching, sometimes people will kind of, but when you say it sounds like that's where your faith really is, people then they back off because it feels like you're being religious. And my dad's thing is, it's faith is not evidence-based. And I think that's just a piece that he missed, that really all faith is evidence-based. And so the question is the nature of, how one gains the evidence, and to recognize, as Polanyi points out, all science and hence all faith is the work of human beings. And it develops over time. It's not a fixed thing. It's a developing way of being in relation to the world. So the nature of science is faith here. My dad's really in the back of my head. Science was his faith, and it was a narrow science that really limited him in ways that were tragic. But it's just the tragedy of the short-sightedness of seeing all that could open up. A science who really has a full-blown faith, I think, is an exciting person. They'll see the world with wonder. There's all kinds of things that will explode out of that. Which, ironically, my dad loved to teach kids about electricity. He loved to teach them to play the ukulele. And it was this, what I call a deeper Christianity. He really loved to share the wonder of the world with people. But he just couldn't own it as his faith.
Yeah, boy, that's poignant again, Marty. It reminds me of a scientist whom I admire so much. For example, this scientist studied barnacles for 8 years, living in fossil forms. 8 years just studying barnacles, and wrote 2 beautiful books full of color illustrations and several articles, and became the world's first expert on barnacles. This was in the 1840s. His name is Charles Darwin, and when Darwin's son,
pretty well known.
Yeah, when Darwin's son went to visit a neighbor, he said to his friend, "Where does your daddy do his barnacles?" Just thought that was as normal as reading a book.
Yes.
But Darwin started out with this typical romanicist, Wordsworthian, Coleridgean kind of sense of the wonder and sublimity of nature, and was regarded as a proponent of that by most contemporaries. Leading romantic figures from the continent wrote him, corresponded with him, saw him as one of their own. And then late in life, there's this famous passage in Darwin's autobiography where he's really reflecting on the impoverishment of the scientific imagination that happened due to this cloud of reductionistic thinking or overly empiricist thinking that had descended upon him. Let me just read that passage really quickly. This is Darwin. This curious and lamentable loss of the higher aesthetic tastes. No, actually, I'll back up a paragraph. Here's Darwin, quote, "I have said that in one respect, my mind has changed during the last 20 or 30 years. Up to the age of 30 or beyond it, poetry of many kinds, such as the works of Milton, Gray, Byron, Wordsworth, Coleridge, and Shelley, gave me great pleasure. I have also said that formerly pictures," he means art, "gave me considerable and music very great delight. But now for many years I cannot endure to read a line of poetry. I have also almost lost any taste for pictures or music. I retain some taste for fine scenery, but it does not cause me the exquisite delight which it formerly did. Or I might add, which his writings, like his Journal of the Voyage of the Beagle, caused in others, evoked in others." And then he goes on, "This curious and lamentable loss of the higher aesthetic taste is all the odder. My mind seems to have become a kind of machine for grinding general laws out of large collections of facts. But why this should have caused the atrophy of that part of the brain alone on which the higher tastes depend, I cannot conceive. If I had to live my life again, I would have made a rule to read some poetry and listen to some music at least once every week. And he's talking to scientists. For perhaps the parts of my brain now atrophied could thus have been kept active through use. The loss of these tastes is a loss of happiness and may possibly be injurious to the intellect and more probably to the moral character by enfeebling the emotional and imaginative part of our nature. So even without imagination, the sciences perish.
That's right.
Without a vision, the people perish. And in this section, you actually bring up the peril of a reductionistic mode of engaging in the natural sciences. Darwin's exhibit A for that. But someone who has an over naive sense of science as just empiricism, this machine that can classify the facts, as Darwin said, is in a way experiencing the toxic fumes of that reductionism that pervades so many of the sciences. So I wonder if you'd like to comment on your discussion of the reduction of the personal to the merely physical, the nothing but, as Donald Mackay called it.
Which somebody calls it nothing buttery. I love the buttery image of that.
Perfect. Page 71 is where you're at on that.
Well, I mean, I think that, you know, particularly in the sciences, people love to think about, you know, neurobiology and what brain studies are doing. And I think that it's part of what's going on. Every Valentine's Day that comes around, we get told that it's just chemicals in the body that are doing things, that love isn't really, quote unquote, real. And that's all. It's all just ways of explaining something that diminish something that is huge. And so the ability to recognize the fullness of what it is that needs to be discovered when we look at somebody and call them a person, which I'm quite curious with dogs and so forth. Our dog was a very personable dog. And I think C.S. Lewis in the Chronicles of Narnia, the way he had animals talk, and even in the creation scene, he gave to the animals a dimension of the personal that I think it's just a wonderful play. And he suggests in other places that human beings can lose what it means to be persons, that they become wild animals again. Thinking in Prince Caspian, the bear who gets shot and the two girls have a conversation. What if in our world someday humans went wild inside and we couldn't tell? And I just think we are approaching an era where that question of the loss of our personhood is a reductionism, because we've become diminished as what it means to be persons in a way that is a loss of that for which we were actually created to be.
Yes, I do. I was thinking, in fact, of Lewis's description of his descent into atheism as a teenager and young man, which he saw as doing in parallel with those around him due to the pressures of reductionistic science, among others. And, you know, as I was reading that quote from Darwin, I was thinking of Lewis's animals that lose the ability to speak, a very tragic development. Or
you think of Uncle Andrew, who when he came in, he couldn't hear the animals. And so they plant him and water him. So here you have the animals watering and thinking, you know, trying to bring him. So anyway, it's a wonderful, playful irony that he's got going on there.
Alan,
one other thing in this chapter that I wanted to just quickly point out, well, I remember hearing it from Alan Torrance, is on 73, just the whole sense of the scientific community and the community of the church, that in both cases, you have to learn a history of interpretation. If you don't learn the history of where it all came from, you won't have the context to understand it. And you need to learn the language of the discipline. And this is true of all disciplines. And so in theology, that's true. And you have to enter into a community of dedicated learners, people who are interested and who will work with you in learning that. And then to recognize the specific tools appropriate to the discipline. You can't use a microscope for studying the stars, and you can't use natural science for studying God, because you won't be looking at God. So anyway, just to recognize that the parallel in what it looks like to do good scientific work has these four features. And I think TF mentioned them. Alan Torrance is the one I heard it from. I think he got that probably from TF. But anyway, for me, that was
I think that's a brilliant point, Marty. And I'm so glad you put it in this chapter. And I didn't want to pass page 73 without looking at that. Those four points, page 73, I think I write a rectangle around it and put some stars in the margin. I think that's really profound, and we could pursue that at length. For example, number 3, the community of dedicated learners, the church, for someone doing church dogmatics rather than an abstract systematic theology. But the community,
this reading group.
Pardon?
Or this reading group.
Yeah, or this reading group. Perfect. Yeah, yeah. And that's how earlier in the article you had actually brought up how reality, our understanding of reality is socially constructed, but it's in a community of dedicated learners that becomes a faithful social construction. This openness to reality we're describing, that is the posture of faith-seeking understanding. It's got to be in a community, and that community is going to be using a common language, and then that community has a dynamic existence over time that we take into account, and in which these specific tools are being developed. So those 4 points, I think they are a really profound way to show that there aren't two cultures, as C.P. Snow put it, but rather the cultures of science in any discipline, natural or theological science, have commonalities on a profound level. And that means that then we can definitely enter into dialogue on the nature of those 4 points. Even if I have nothing in common with someone in another field of science, I can talk to them about what are your understandings about the nature of the dedicated community of interpretation, et cetera. And so there's going to be that level of conversation that goes beyond in any particular domain considered on its own. Yeah. So I'm so glad you brought that up. That's great.
And even my TED Talk that I did on the nature of personal relationships draws on theological affirmations that came from a couple of articles on Karl Barth and Karl Barth's own work, using none of Karl Barth's language specifically, but it's, if you know Barth and you know David Miel's article on recursion, you would recognize this is all theologically framed and put into a TED Talk where it makes a huge difference in understanding the science of the personal.
Yeah, yeah. And I do believe that T.F. Torrance's optimism that theologians would have much to learn from scientists is partly around these 4 points.
Yeah.
That there's always the possibility of dialogue on points like this, where we can learn more about the nature of the theologian's task.
Yep.
Okay, we can come back to more points in this section. We've not exhausted any of the sections in this chapter, but let's go ahead and open up the Faith as Science section on page 75. And let me just ask one question that I think there are at least 5 major answers to in this section. And the question is, what are the various ways that faith contributes to the natural sciences?
The nature of faith is that it recognizes that faith is a personal engagement with the world. And if it's personal, it's not just personal for personal self-interest, it's a interest for the sake of others. And if the God who is the founding other, who has created this, then one serves God by knowing and understanding the gift of the world in which one lives. And so that can have the practical applications just to how I take care of my garden and how I cook, that there's a sense, God made this food to be eaten and to delight in it. And so the nature of the doxology of what it means to invite people into that space. People don't think of culinary arts necessarily as culinary science, but one could say that it is both art and science. And when done in the spirit of hospitality, in the service of God, we've integrated theology, science, and art in a meal. And when I have people over for dinner, I attempt to do all 3 of those. So when somebody walks out, I hope that they feel like I've never been cared for in the way that you cared for me. And the food that you fed me tasted amazing. And it was beautiful, the way you arranged it and the sequence of the evening. You must have spent days. And usually I've spent a lifetime preparing all of that. And so there is a sense in which faith integrates into our life ways of honoring God and one another, of understanding the natural world. My gardens also tend to look relatively beautiful, and I share from the garden. And I go to my neighbors and help them prune their roses and their trees. And yeah, it's a way of integrating what it means to be somebody who knows scientifically when do you prune, how do you trim a Japanese maple so that it does what a Japanese maple is supposed to do. So I'm being scientific at that point with an aesthetic dimension of what is the beauty of bringing this out. And I'm doing, I have two neighbors who I trim their Japanese maples for them, and I'm teaching them as I go also. So I'm extending my skills. And I've had people who actually say, you know what, last week I was at my sister's, and what you told me, I did their tree. And for me, that is a theological impetus that's being extended through the natural sciences and caring for other people. In a broader kind of way, to say, when we have people who aren't stopped by thinking that is just a tree, that is just an animal, that's just a forest, but say this is a forest, that how do we take care of this forest? Who lives in this forest? That we're thinking theologically about God as the one who cares for these things. And sometimes it means we're going to prune and we're going to take out some trees, but we also recognize that there are owls living in this forest. So, how do we make sure that we aren't having species go extinct? And so the whole stewardship piece clearly comes out. We should have the greatest guides, particularly here in Washington, that the church gets people out into the mountains and onto the rivers and kayaks and talks about the wonder of what it is that we're going through. And as you talk about a geologist giving us eyes to see, there's so much that we don't see and can't hear. And that's why I love having good tour guides. And we should be, using Bruce's term, we should be curators and docents of the world. We should be theologically just filling the space in which we live with the wonder of seeing what it is that God has done, is doing, or could be doing as we align our lives around his purposes. So those are, I don't know if those collapse into any of what you were going to say for your 5 positions, but anyway, that's what come to mind.
Well, that's great. What I love about your whole discussion today is you're sketching a vision for us of science that is not only large enough for the sciences of the personal, of the person, but also the natural sciences themselves are essentially and ineradicably personal endeavors. Yep. Everything you were just describing there illustrates the personal nature of our engagement with the natural world. The 5 that I had, I put in the chat. So faith contributes to the natural sciences, 1, by keeping it personal, so it doesn't degrade into the impersonal, by leading toward friendship. And you have that wonderful John McMurray quote on page 76. All meaningful knowledge is for the purpose of action. All meaningful action is for the purpose of friendship.
Including with the natural world.
Yeah. And 3rd, faith contributes motivation, meaning, and value to science. And 4th, the applications of science that are ethical and beneficial and acts of service and love rather than acts of power and oppression. And then 5th, what we were talking earlier about how this standpoint of faith seeking understanding means there's curiosity and wonder that is maintained, not just the God of the gaps kind of approach. So those are some. Any comments on those that you'd like to make?
Well, the nature of all of them in this idea that faith is science is that faith is really an openness to the world and to other persons, to the other scientists who know things that we don't know. I mean, that's one of the delights that I have with you, is you keep opening my eyes to new branches of science. and the story that lies behind them, and how it gives me even eyes to see the things that I do. When I read a book once on the history of psychology, to see the whole progression of going through the machine model to the animal model, the progression there, and to go, oh, there's something about seeing how we look through lenses to try and develop an understanding. And at some level, psychology hasn't quite shed the machine model or the animal model. And you don't have to shed them entirely. You just have to be open to what Polanyi and Torrance would talk about as the next paradigm. I mean, that's somewhat Kuhn language, but to see that the next fuller vision of what could be, so that the nature of faith allows us to be open enough to other learners, people of faith or not, but to see with the eyes of faith that even those things open up to us a vision of the world in ways that enriches our scientific capacity and see what otherwise couldn't be there. And Einstein was great with, I think, crossing over into those metaphors. And I once saw a definition of a scientist is merely somebody who is able to take thoughts from one world, bring them into another world of thought, and see what couldn't have been seen before in such a way that they see what was not seen before. And Einstein was particularly good at that. And I thought, wow, how wonderful that, that metaphors open us up to actuality. And that is parallels. Faith opens us up to see all of the multi-dimensions of things that are there. They require the spirit to help make those transitions of sights and understanding that are possible to be there. So that's, a broader vision of this, of what's present and all that. And to be friends with them, I mean, your point too, there's something about liking flowers instead of not liking flowers. If you like flowers, you will engage flowers, you will grow them, you will prune your roses, and people will come and smell them and look at them and say, wow, those are beautiful. If you don't have a friendship with roses, you won't grow them, and your garden it'll be missing something, right? So to just recognize even the friendship you make with your garden makes a difference for you and the flowers and the people who visit. We're not aware of all that even that friendship does in opening up a faith that seeks understanding, that really has an ongoing, not even intended blessing in so many ways that enriches the life not only of ourselves, but others as well.
Thank you, Marty. I have one more question, and then we can just open it up for other questions in chat or that people want to ask. So to conclude, back to your own journey where we started there. Was this chapter an essay you wish someone had given your younger self to read? And what difference does it make for you today? And I'd just like to invite you, if you'd like to tell us more about the significance of this chapter for you personally.
Yeah. When I was a kid, I would sit at the table and listen to my dad and my uncle and my older brother talk, and I felt like I could say nothing. And it's because I was missing this chapter in a sense.
Yeah.
They seemed to have knowledge that had power to it. I mean, knowledge is power was particularly something that that became a block for me. And so to get to the point in life where I could write this chapter, which, by the way, every chapter in all three of these books, I just saw as a preparatory introduction to a whole nother book. So every chapter here, really, I need to write the book that this is an introduction to, which in this case, this is the book, The Science of the Personal, in a sense, is playing this out. But my younger self would have had a confidence that there isn't just a group of people who are called scientists who can tell much of the rest of the world, who people call believers or whatever in some form of religion, that they have nothing to say. And it would have given me the ability to be scientific enough to recognize we all come to the table with a perspective and eyes to see, and we each have a gift that's in that. And to be able to put that out there with some level of confidence, which I love Leslie Newbegin's book, Proper Confidence, that we are never pursuing certainty, but confidence is a personal engagement that I know enough to be confident in at least this, and con with fide, faith. The confidence is a faith in being with the world and with other people to be myself. So at one level, I just couldn't be myself sitting at those tables. And so to get to the point where I could write this chapter, it's a recognition that I can be myself and put that out there and invite others into the space where they can recognize that being a person of faith has all the validity in the world and the willingness to be questioned, to say, let's talk about that. I think we can take what you have affirmed here and say you believe, and let's help your unbelief by clarifying. And in some cases to say there are things that we don't know, and that's okay, because there are always going to be things we don't know, but that shouldn't be the wall either. Say what you do know and affirm. I mean, even when people say, but you can't see Jesus alive today, it's like, the fact that that person came and changed history, and what year is it? I mean, the years themselves are still numbered, because the history of the culture we live in acknowledged that there was a reality there that still, even if people do common era, CE or BCE, there's still a residue that recognizes the history of humanity as we know it in the world today is still has this ingrown place that we can, as those who recognize the faith of science and the science of faith, can say the best place that we seem to be able to start is to recognize the universe is personal, and that person wants to be known, has come to be known, can still be known, and there's a community who's also needed to really grow in the depth of understanding of what that knowledge means. And so I became a theologian. But the little tagline I often put with that, I'm a theologian who's committed to being loving and nurturing in all my relationships, which includes students, clients, my kids, my wife. Being a theologian just means I will be oriented in living my science in understanding who each of them is in such a way that I can lovingly be that. And so faith and science are integrated even in my many roles that I play, but that it all lives from the motive of love, because that is the nature and character of the God who created this world. And my living in it is to live from that motive in the science of the particularity of each person to whom I extend that love. Did I answer your question?
Thank you, Marty. Yes, you sure did. This has been wonderful. Are there any, let me just invite anyone, if there's a question in chat that we overlooked, post it again or unmute and join in.
Todd has one quick question here on addictions. And I mean, it's a broad statement, but the short answer to it is that theologically, perfect love casts out fear. And the reason people pursue addictions is because there is a self-orientation, an interpretation of the world that isn't true to the nature of God or their community or themselves. And so all the addictions that are used to deal with what becomes fearful in the world, which Adam, after he's had his eyes open, hides. And when asked, where are you? He said, I'm hiding, I was afraid. So to say the nature of a humanity who does not know the love of God is ultimately going to hide some way. And the nature of hiding takes for many people the form of an addiction, whether it's to drug and alcohol, or whether it's to work, or whether it's to a hobby, whatever it is, they're hiding from the reality of loving and knowing God, loving and knowing their neighbor. And so all of the addictions at some level are just replacements, we might call them idols, that one takes up to hide in what seems to be a safe place. But the nature of their safety is because they're afraid of what it would mean to be an authentic human being who shows up loved and able to love others. And so the hope of a Trinitarian theology is to reintroduce a world where truthfulness in loving is acted out in such a way that people are able to be who they are, be loved for who they are, and nurtured and encouraged into all that God would have them to be. And that is the healing process out of our addictive places. It's very complex for some people who, from the very time they were born, grew up in a very toxic environment. So it takes better science to look at what love looks like to do a transforming work in those kinds of places. That's the short answer.
Actually, Kerry, I want to ask Marty an interesting, because this is my detached observer here. The one thing I notice about Marty, and like in all of us that are in this community, is that a lot of us are pursuing our uniqueness in this way, that we have a lot of similarities, but the uniqueness that Marty has in his approach, and yourself, Kerry, like the more you meet these things, because I know you to a degree, but and it's kind of hard when we're just hearing the language, but more and more, like, because that's the thing that Dr. Houston always used to talk about, that the more you follow Christ, the more you're shaped into Christ. He's this unique Son of God by nature, but the more you fulfill your Christ-given role, whether it's a scientist or a theologian or just a husband or a father, your uniqueness comes out. And that's the thing that I find out I find in this group, is that it's an unstated assumption. Like, the reason why we find each other so interesting is because we recognize each other's uniqueness.
I think that's true. Good. Yeah, and I was just reading in Tom Smell today on the Spirit, and he says, the Spirit is the one who, in a sense, brings us to know Christ in such a way that our uniqueness is nurtured. It's not that we imitate Christ, but that it's in discovering Christ that the Spirit really develops what you described as that uniqueness that we might become. And then the body is rich and multifaceted, and we proceed with wonder at the joy of being with these people. Thanks, Dwayne. Kerry, you re-raised the question that Tim had asked. Why do you think some lose a sense of wonder as we get older? And there was a study that was done on newlyweds and roommates at college for 3 years. What they found is that the persons usually felt on a graph in an upgoing way that they knew what the other person thought and felt. So that after 3 years, they had a high sense of confidence that they knew that the person felt. Inversely, at the end of the 3 years, the accuracy of knowing what that person thought or felt went down. And so they had a high level of confidence with a low level of accuracy. And so that is to say, when we don't proceed with wonder, and we start thinking, oh, I know this person, or I know about that, once we get a kind of security in thinking that we know, we quit our wonder and we just log it with things that we know. And we are going to move away from reality in that sense. And so I think the way that we get taught as kids, where we have a lot of wonder and we're introduced to new subjects in sociology and history, and we have a lot of stuff that comes at us, and then we think we know it. And so we think, oh, I don't need to study about that anymore. I took a class years ago. Ironically, there's no classes that I've seen K through 12 that are specifically on the nurture and development of relationships. So some people go from STEM to STEAM and add the arts. I want STREAM, science, technology, relationships. The R in streams. So if we don't have ways that we are continually stimulated, we just come to fossilize our thoughts, and there we know just enough not to explore, and we lose our sense of interest in really exploring what's going on. Those who explored a National Geographic or other shows like that might get that wonder to be awakened. We are largely afraid of what other people think of us, and we assume they're probably afraid of what we think of them. So we have a tendency not to be particularly open and investigative because we don't want to offend somebody or foist ourselves on them or dig too deep. And so we just quit wondering about other people. And so we just think, oh, they're that person and that's their role. That's Kerry. He's a science teacher. He knows beyond what I know. I don't know if he's a teacher or what. What does he do? Well, I know he's a nice guy. And we lose the wonder instead of listening for 10 minutes and going, wow, there's so much to discover here. So as soon as we assume that we know, then we are going to stop wondering. And we seem to know so much as we get older, but we really know so little. I think it's Torrance who says that by the time a child is 3, they know more about physics than I think he talks about a great philosopher of physics or a great physicist will know, because there's so much learning that they're just open to it. There's no fear of getting it wrong or anything, though, that a highly developed scholar is afraid of somebody critiquing and getting it wrong. There's a limitation, a focus that keeps them from wondering as big as a wild and wonderful child in their early years will take on. So children entering the kingdom of God, I think wonder is one of the pieces of that is significant. And as we get older, to have science as faith and faith as science is to say in every aspect of life, wonder is going to be the element that is going to really be the telltale sign of the Spirit that both science and faith are fully at work, and the whole world is an adventure waiting to happen.
Everyone, Marty Folsom, the Face-to-Face series, Volume 3, Sharing God's Life, Chapter 3, Science as Faith and Faith as Science. Marty, it was our privilege to have you come to the reading group today as interviewee instead of as host. Thank you so much.
So great, Kerry, to have you lead the conversation. Thank you so much, and to everyone else for their comments and questions and engagement. A delightful time.